If you suddenly won first prize in the lottery one day, what would you do with the money? You might buy a house, travel the world, or pay off all your accumulated debt and start a new life. However, here is a woman who used that money not for simple consumption, but for a choice that staked her entire life. And what makes this story special is not the lottery ticket itself, but what happened afterward. From that moment on, her life began to flow in a completely different direction. The path was never easy, filled with countless failures, harsh realities, and precarious moments where a single choice could bring everything crashing down. But what is even more surprising is the fact that, until then, not a single person could have ever imagined she would later become an iconic actor representing Hollywood. Her name is Sandra Oh, an actor born as a Korean Canadian who has created numerous firsts in the global entertainment industry. However, behind this successful image, we know today lies a long struggle and repeated frustrations that cannot be explained by the simple word effort. Her story is not merely a coming-of-age tale of an actor who became famous, but rather a record showing how a human being broke through social prejudices and structural limitations. In particular, the reality that Asian female actors had to face in the North American film industry in the 1990s was incomparably harsher than it is today, and surviving in it was almost impossible. Nevertheless, Sandra Oh did not give up. Instead, she chose to face that wall head-on. But there was a fact that no one knew at the time. Her biggest fight was not against external discrimination, but against the belief that it was impossible that was gradually seeping into her. And this invisible barrier sometimes held her back more powerfully than any prejudice. Nevertheless, she eventually shattered those limits herself. When Sandra Oh had just graduated from college, what she held in her hands was not a stable future, but only a single uncertain dream. Her desire to become an actor was clear, but the path to turning that dream into reality was barely visible. In the early 1990s North American film industry, the space for Asian actors was extremely limited, and even the roles given were mostly trapped in stereotypes. A foreigner who couldn't speak English properly, a submissive Asian woman, or an exaggerated character. That was all. It was an era where even when Korean appeared in a movie, it was enough for actual meaningless sounds to just sound like Korean. Her parents, who knew this reality better than anyone, strongly opposed their daughter's choice. Unlike her siblings, who were already working in the legal and medical fields, Sandra's path was far too unstable and difficult to understand. Her choice might have seemed like she was the odd one out in the family, heading in the wrong direction. But Sandra did not back down. Instead, she made an even more extreme decision. She gave up going to a regular university where she could have received a full scholarship and chose a much more expensive 3-year drama school. And the price of that choice came back immediately. Her parents completely cut off their financial support, saying, "If you really want to do it on your own." From that moment on, Sandra was completely alone. She had to cover all her tuition and living expenses by herself, beginning a life where she had to juggle part-time jobs and her studies at the same time. As time passed, reality pressured her more and more, and eventually, right before graduation, she was pushed to the brink of being evicted due to unpaid rent. And, without any warning, her life seemed as if it would completely collapse. Whether to keep chasing her dream of becoming an actor or to accept reality and give up, she stood at the crossroads of the most important choice in her life. Up until then, no one knew what all this pain and struggle would lead to in the future. Right at the edge of that despair, Sandra Oh's life began to change direction in an unexpected way. During that time when everything seemed to be falling apart, she happened to buy a lottery ticket. The reason was nothing special. It was a close friend's birthday. But having no money to even buy a gift, she picked out the cheapest lottery ticket to show at least a minimum of sincerity. And right there, on an impulse, she bought one more ticket for herself. No one imagined that this choice would change her life. Returning home, she began scratching the lottery ticket with a coin without much expectation. However, as the same picture began to appear repeatedly, one space after another, her hands started to tremble. And the moment the identical picture was completed in the final space, a result hard to believe as reality unfolded before her eyes. Winning first prize. She blankly checked the winning amount as if her breath had stopped. It was about 7 million won, which might not be a large sum by today's standards. But for her at the time, it was like the only chance to get her life back on track. On the surface, it seemed like simple luck, but its meaning was much deeper. As she paid off her overdue rent and had a proper meal for the first time in a long while, she began to feel that the money was not just a bonus, but a kind of message. It was like a signal telling her, "Do not give up here." And at that very moment, she made up her mind once again to go down this path to the very end. However, that resolve would bring about yet another challenge. She decided to persuade her parents again, this time not with words but with actions. She wrote a script herself, prepared a stage, and created a play exclusively for her parents. The protagonist in the play was a character who poured out her true feelings to parents who opposed her dream of becoming an actor, and it contained Sandra's own emotions, scars, and all the stories she hadn't been able to tell until then. That stage was not a simple performance, but a persuasion that staked her life. There was a fact that no one knew at the time, that one short play was doing more than just changing her parents' minds. It was creating the most important foundation of support that would sustain her entire life. And that change became the starting point that enabled her to endure the much more massive walls she would face in the future. Even after gaining her parents' support, reality did not change at all. Audition rooms were still cold, and good roles always went to other people. Especially in a structure where white actors took most of the leading roles, the opportunities given to Sandra Oh were always limited. But this time was different. She decided not to wait anymore. Instead, she resolved to tenaciously dig into even the smallest crack she could fit through. Meanwhile, an audition notice caught her eye. It was a project based on the life of a real Asian woman, and it was a very rare opportunity where the protagonist was also set as Asian. The problem was the location, a distant city, a whopping 7 hours away by car. But Sandra did not hesitate. To seize that opportunity, she got on an overnight bus, intentionally arriving at dawn and spending the night on a terminal chair. And the next morning, she walked into the audition room, looking shabby and unwashed. Her strategy was simple: to become the character itself. To fit the role of a runaway homeless girl, she had prepared perfectly, starting with her appearance. However, the result was different from what she expected. The production team was taken aback by her appearance and actually got a negative first impression. At that moment when everything seemed like it would end in failure, she did something unexpected. After asking for some time to prepare, she just lay down flat on the floor of the audition room, and without saying a word, she stared at the ceiling for 5 minutes. This is a part that most people never hear about. Those 5 minutes were not simple silence, but a perfect piece of directing that focused all eyes on her. While the flustered production team didn't know how to react, Sandra suddenly stood up and poured out an explosive, emotional performance. It was a brief moment, but its intensity was enough to overturn all previous impressions. Ultimately, she was selected for the lead role out of thousands of applicants. Her first starring work, completed in this way, was a project dealing with the tragic life of a real person. For realistic acting, filming took place with actual people on the streets, and that environment was by no means easy. But Sandra found her own way even within that, and as a result, she received high praise for her acting skills. And through this work, she began to be recognized as an actor with potential for the first time. However, that success soon brought her face to face with another reality. On the outside, it looked like success, but on the inside, something was crumbling. The first achievement she had built up was certainly meaningful, but it was still not enough to open the doors to the massive world of Hollywood. And right at that point, she chose to take on an even greater challenge once again. Although she had achieved the milestone of her first leading role, the journey was by no means filled only with glamorous stories. Rather, from the moment the camera stopped rolling, she had to face an entirely different kind of pressure. The filming environment, where she practically lived with actual street youths to enhance the realism of the work, was gradually pushing her toward a dangerous edge. People around her casually offered illegal drugs, and it began to feel not just like a simple temptation, but a test of her authenticity as an actor. At first, she firmly refused. However, as time passed, cracks began to form in her resolve. The thought, to truly understand it, shouldn't I experience it myself, began to cross her mind. That thought lasted only for a brief moment, but it was dangerously intense. And right then, she realized just how perilous a boundary she was standing on. And, without any warning, everything could have collapsed. If she had made one wrong choice in that moment, her life might have headed in a completely different direction. But Sandra stopped right there. Instead, she decided to control herself in an extreme manner. As soon as filming ended, she would go straight home, cut off contact with the outside world, avoid alcohol and even stimulating foods, and force herself into a state of complete isolation. Behind the camera, the story was completely different. While delivering intensely emotional performances during the day, she had to live a disciplined life like a monk at night. That dual life was never easy, but ultimately, it protected her. She succeeded in strictly separating her role from reality, and thanks to that, she was able to escape dangerous temptations. This experience would also leave a profound impact on her acting style moving forward. But the real problem came next. After the project was released, the situation began to unfold in a completely different direction from the reaction she had expected. The response from the Korean American community she belonged to, in particular, came as an even greater shock to her. And that reaction went beyond mere criticism, beginning to shake her very identity. There was a fact that no one knew at the time, that this first success would not be an opportunity for her, but rather the starting point of an even greater test. And that test would not be a simple matter of acting, but a question asking who she was and how much she could endure. Right after the project was released, the reaction Sandra Oh expected was applause and recognition. However, reality was completely different. Especially within the Korean community her family belonged to, the atmosphere began to noticeably change. Her parents, who went to church as usual, sensed a strange vibe as people avoided their gaze. Those who used to greet them suddenly began to distance themselves, and the reason was soon revealed. The fact that she had played a character exposed to prostitution and drugs in the movie spread quickly, followed by accusations that she had tarnished the image of Koreans. To her, acting was just a role, but to some, it was taken as reality, and that gap was much deeper than expected. Sandra realized for the first time that the character she chose to play could be interpreted not just as a personal choice, but as an issue representing an entire group. That shock lingered within her for a long time. Ironically, however, it was precisely because of that project that her acting skills began to be officially recognized. After being nominated for the most prestigious award in the Canadian film industry and subsequently winning for another project, she instantly emerged as an actor to watch. Naturally, her sights turned to a bigger stage, Hollywood. With no language barrier and having already proven her capabilities, she believed there was plenty of potential. But that choice meant colliding with yet another reality. When the truth was finally revealed, it was much darker than anyone had anticipated. What she faced in Hollywood was not an expansion of opportunities but more blatant discrimination. The remarks she heard in audition rooms went beyond simple evaluations and bordered on insults. There were comments judging her appearance, dividing her face top and bottom, saying things like, "The top half looks like a man, and only the bottom half looks like a woman," and even suggestions to get plastic surgery. But there was something else that cut deeper than all those words. One agent told her coldly, "With an Asian appearance like yours, getting a leading role in Hollywood is impossible." That statement didn't sound like a mere opinion, but rather an already decided fact. They even cited the reality that fellow Asian actors rarely got opportunities, adding the advice that she should return to Canada. In that moment, the confidence she had built up seemed to completely crumble. And, without any warning, she found herself facing another extreme choice. She seriously began considering heading to South Korea for plastic surgery. Ironically, the consultation result evaluated her as having the most ideal face for making changes. Those words shook her even more. If she made this choice, everything could change. But at the same time, it would mean denying who she had been up until now. This is the part that most people never hear. Ultimately, what stopped her wasn't flashy advice or industry standards, but a single remark from her closest family member. Her sister said, "You got that role because of that face." The words were simple, but they were enough to bring her back to reality. And in that moment, Sandra made a decision. She would compete exactly as she was, not as the image someone else wanted. After the decision to forgo plastic surgery, Sandra Oh had to start over from scratch. The title of promising actor no longer held any meaning, and in Hollywood, she essentially returned to the status of an unknown. Small roles, just a few lines of dialogue, or even scenes where her name wasn't properly credited. She accepted whatever came her way and persevered step by step. But this time was different from before. She no longer tried to fit someone else's standards, and she had a firm direction to build her career on her own terms. As time passed, an opportunity came that would turn her life upside down once again. An audition for a medical drama and a character with a unique personality within it. A doctor who was clumsy at expressing emotions, but more human than anyone else. Christina Young. This role was not a simple supporting part. She was a core figure who would help drive the center of the story, and above all, she had a completely different texture from existing Asian female characters. Sandra did not miss this opportunity. However, that process was not smooth either. Opinions on casting were divided even within the production team, and some still harbored doubts about whether an Asian actor could pull off this role. Nevertheless, she interpreted the character in her own way during the audition and ultimately secured the part. And this choice, as a result, became a decision that changed the direction of the entire show. Behind the camera, the story was completely different. As soon as filming began, she went beyond merely acting out the script and became the character herself. Her performance, suppressing emotions yet momentarily exploding them, and her expressive power revealing both cold rationality and deep inner wounds simultaneously, left a powerful impression on viewers. As the broadcast continued, the character of Christina Yang gradually began to establish herself as the core of the series. On the outside, it looked like success, but internally another conflict was beginning. As the show gained massive popularity, her name also quickly became known, but at the same time, the responsibilities and pressure grew as well. Expectations for the character, viewer reactions, and even subtle tensions with the production team. Everything intertwined complexly, putting her to the test once again. And right at that point, a change also came to her personal life. A relationship with a colleague she met through filming slowly developed into love, ultimately leading to the choice of marriage. At first, it seemed like an ideal relationship where they understood and supported each other's careers. However, as time passed, their relationship gradually began to show cracks. As their projects, careers, and respective directions began to clash, the conflict deepened. But what happened next changed everything. Ultimately, the two chose to divorce, and the process was by no means quiet. The situation became even more complicated as personal emotions intertwined with complex issues connected to their careers. Going through that entire process, Sandra found herself asking once again whether continuing on this path was the right choice. There was a fact that no one knew at the time, that all this conflict and collapse would not break her, but rather serve as a catalyst to elevate her to a completely different level. And that transformation would go beyond simple success to be remembered as a legacy. After her divorce, Sandra Oh seemed to step back from the spotlight for a while. Outwardly, she was still a successful actor, but internally a time had come when she needed to redefine her direction. The long time spent with one character gave her a sense of stability, but at the same time, it was keeping her confined within that mold. She began to feel that the moment had come to break that mold. However, it was also a choice to abandon familiarity and step back into uncertainty. She eventually decided to leave the show she had been with for a long time. It was a difficult decision for many to understand, but for Sandra, it was an essential change. Afterwards, she chose a path not just to remain a famous actor, but to be reborn as an actor with her own distinct color. And in that process, she encountered another important project. It was a role that demanded a completely different atmosphere, a completely different character, and a much more complex emotional arc than before. When the truth was finally revealed, it was much darker than anyone had anticipated. In that new project, she went beyond simple acting, drawing out the anxiety, obsession, and even destructive emotions hidden deep within the human psyche. It was a completely different face she had never shown before. It left an almost shocking impression on viewers, while simultaneously serving as an opportunity to prove just how broad her acting spectrum was. Through this project, Sandra set new records once again. She received nominations and awards at major ceremonies, a rarity for Asian actors, and garnered global attention. But there was a more important change. The characters she created were no longer perceived as roles for Asian actors, but began to be accepted as completely independent beings as humans. And that created a subtle yet undeniable shift across the entire industry. Behind the camera, the story was completely different. Compared to that moment years ago when she debated changing her face, she now stood in a completely different position. She no longer tried to fit herself into someone else's standards. Instead, she had become someone who created new standards. And that transformation went beyond mere personal success, serving to open up new possibilities for countless actors who would emerge after her. On the surface, it might look like a single career, but within it, there was a repeated process of countless choices, sacrifices, and getting back up again. And right within that repetition, Sandra Oh forged her own path. There was a fact that no one knew at the time, that this path she walked would one day remain as proof of possibility for someone else. Looking back on Sandra Oh's journey, it traces a complex trajectory that cannot be explained by a simple success story. A single lottery ticket that started like a coincidence merely bought her time. But how she used that time was entirely up to her choices. And she didn't use that time to run away or compromise. She used it to endure and face things head-on until the very end. Those choices piled up, ultimately making her who she is today. But the core of this story is not the result. Rather, what matters more is how many times she almost collapsed during that process, and what choices she made each time. The moments she tried to change herself in the face of prejudice, the times she was pushed to the brink of giving up, and even the decisions where she had to go back to square one. At all those crossroads, she ultimately chose to remain herself. And that choice was by no means an easy path. This is the part that most people never hear. The success we see now is a result built upon countless failures, doubts, and unseen struggles. And precisely because of that, this story is not just a biography of a celebrity, but a reason for someone else to try again. It shows that behind a seemingly perfect outcome, there is always an invisible battle. And, without any warning, life can change direction at any time. If for Sandra Oh it was a lottery ticket, for someone else it might take a completely different form. What matters is how you embrace that opportunity when it comes, and what choices you make. She seized that moment and ultimately forged her own path. Even at this very moment, somewhere out there, someone else might be standing before the same questions. Between reality and dreams, between stability and challenge. And while this story doesn't offer a single answer, it clearly shows one thing: that whatever choice you make, if you have the courage to push through to the end, that path will ultimately become your own story. And that story might just become the power that sets someone else's life in motion again.